Welcome to Pleasure as Prayer. My name is Amay Murphy and I am your host. And today I am so grateful to be here with Elaine Yonge. Welcome, Elaine. Her journey has involved a lifelong fascination and inquiry into awareness, purpose, the human condition, love, sexuality, spiritual connection, soul wisdom, expansion, learning, unlearning, meditation, physiology, health, disease, exploring aliveness, sexuality, death, and grief. Wow, it all. Sometimes described by those who experience her work as a Celtic blend of breath worker, body worker, spiritual sexologist, and somatic scientist. It seems there is an alchemy to her work that arises from her training in older lineage traditions, where she studied as a Tantra educator and a shamanic minister, merged and complemented by the modern lineages she has trained in, including certified sexological body worker, somatic sexologist, urban Tantra professional, and certified shamanic breathwork facilitator. She journeyed for 20 years in research and direct patient care as a physiologist and medical scientist in vascular surgery. She brings this powerful experience of the physical manifestations of disease to her current offerings. Wow. Thank you so much, Elaine, for being here to share your wisdom with us about pleasure.
One of my favorite topics. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. And I'm really pleased to see pleasure becoming a headlining topic in a healthy, conscious way, which hasn't always been the case. So one of my own offerings is titled Pleasure. And I found when I named it that it was a little confronting for people on many levels. And on Facebook adverts, they considered it a dodgy term. So I'm glad to see something else that's titling pleasure and putting it out there as something in this instance connected to prayer and spirituality.
Yes. So I know you're a facilitator of so many, supporting so many people with recognizing how we can use pleasure as a form of prayer to connect back with ourselves. And I'm curious, in your daily life, how does pleasure as prayer show up for you?
Mm. So one of the most important things I think, and I always share with people and myself, is with pleasure, it's important to always remember there's a choice. Like there's always a choice, there's always a moment, there's always a possibility, even when you're having a really bad day and even when you're very busy. So for me, it shows up in taking care to touch my body in the morning with moisturizer after I shower, to cup my genitals, my heart when I wake up, when I go to sleep, to physically move my body, to whether that's movement or exercise or dance, and allowing myself to. One of the tricky things with pleasure is it's actually available a lot of the time for us, but we don't receive it. So actually being open to receiving it, the pleasure that's already there, which might be nature, which might be food, which might be loved ones, speaking to people that you love, or lovemaking, or touching people that you love, hugging them. But also, if it's not there, being aware that, you can call it in. Because sometimes my experience of working with a lot of people is like they're sitting waiting for something to show up for them, whether that's a new relationship or pleasure. And that's not to say that for some people it's not harder or more difficult or they have other things going on, but there's always a choice of giving some time and some space each day. Um, and I think the key shift comes when you realize how important it is for health and well-being. When you realize that, and well-being on a physical level and on a mental health level, emotional level, when you realize that, then it becomes much easier to prioritize it, because sometimes pleasure can feel a little hedonistic, or I don't have time for that, or it has to wait till everything else has been done. And yeah, once you realize that actually the body needs it, the spirit needs it, the soul needs it, then you can make it a priority. And I do, and some days to a greater extent than others, but it's always present.
Yeah, it's really a medicine. that we can bring in, because it's a lot about mindset
Yeah.
and how we're relating to life, and the compassion for our own body's needs.
Yeah, yeah, and one of my very favorite teachers ever, Joseph Kramer, who created Sexological Bodywork, his one of his favorite statements was, and probably the first time I heard it that clearly, is pleasure is medicine, and really, really understanding that, and it's also prayer. So I think it's a beautiful thing that you have that in the title. But when people get that, um, yeah, the attitude towards pleasure can change, and there's many reasons why for some people it's difficult for them to experience pleasure on a somatic level, on an emotional level, on a physical level, on a mind level. And for me, with my own journey with pleasure and with others, understanding the model of how different pleasures are connected is part of the thing that starts to free up often where our access to pleasure has been shut down in earlier life, and sometimes understanding where those things happened and unlocking those parts. Often the pleasure model I work with in Master Your Pleasure, which is one of my trainings, works with the 8-level human development, and it's around level 3, which is innocence, games, laughter and play, which then many of us have lost. And this affects the capacity for all the other pleasures, for mental pleasure, sensual pleasure, spiritual, sexual pleasure. So it's simple and on one level, and it's not on another, because most of us have a complex relationship with pleasure.
Right. Why is it such a challenge for people? What do you see? What have you
Mm,
seen through your years of working in this field around what really gets in people's way of
mm,
really receiving pleasure?
mm. There's a few very strong factors. Everyone is different, but the very strong factors are usually cultural, religious conditioning, a very big one. Deservingness, am I deserving enough is another. There's a weird paradox that people are actually afraid of receiving pleasure because there's a fear of too much, of being overwhelmed, of being lost in pleasure, and there's a fear of losing. So there's quite a lot of kind of complex pieces that work on the emotional level, physical level. And then there's the body level, where many people are disconnected from the body. Like if you scan the general public population, most people are walking around living here. So if we're talking about pleasures that come through the body in terms of sensual or nurturing or even taste and enjoyment of food, if you're disconnected from your body, you're not going to experience pleasure in things that actually could be very pleasurable. So there can be blocks that come in the nervous system from learning, conditioning, trauma can be a big one, particularly around sexual pleasure and sensual pleasure. But even emotional abuse can affect our capacity to feel pleasure in our emotional body. And years of conditioning of the mind can block our capacity to receive and understand mental pleasure. So many people have the very strong inner critic in their mind that's always bashing them every time they try to open. So when I started really deeply looking at pleasure specifically in about 2016, which is when I started working on the experience that has now become this master your pleasure body of work, was why, what stops people and how can we reopen them. And it's multifactorial, and it's different for everyone. So yeah, deserving, belief, conditioning, lack of connection to the body, fear of overwhelm, fear of loss, um, no modeling of it. And there's also this strange psychology that exists where many of us, particularly those I was brought up a Roman Catholic, for a certain number of years, and people in very strong Christian or other types of Muslim religions, where there's like a punishment ethos in the human condition, where we sort of believe that suffering is good, that being a martyr is good, that being a hard life is good. We'll be rewarded in heaven, but we have to suffer now. So there's quite a lot of interesting mindsets around believing that actually we deserve to suffer and not to have pleasure. And that plays out differently in some individuals very strongly. But yeah, understanding the belief that it's somehow noble to be in suffering. And there's an addiction also in many people in modern society to the identification with pain and suffering. And there's a lot of work out there on the pain body and how our personal pain body and the collective pain body takes over. It's like this part of us that actually begins to feed and thrive on that. So actually we're sometimes so consumed with that that it's hard to feel something else. And one of my favorite books ever is a book called The Prophet by Cahill Gibran, and he has this amazing line on joy and sorrow, and understanding that while one is eating at your table, the other is asleep in your bed. And for me, part of the dance of allowing pleasure and joy is actually your capacity to also experience sadness and pain. Because if you shut down this end of experiences, you also usually shut down this. And then we live in this very neutral, central place where nothing makes us really happy and nothing makes us really sad. And so a lot of my own personal journey has been with grief and a quite extreme number of deaths in my life, very close family, quite dramatic, unexpected, um, traumatic type deaths. And through that journey over 10 years, I had to learn or understand, how can I hold both? How can I actually acknowledge that there's pain and not shut it down, deny it, and allow pleasure? How can I acknowledge that I have grief and experience joy? And that's part of the trickiness, is we become polarized. We think that if we have one, we can't have the other. We don't know how to dance, between them and include everything. Um, so overcoming the belief system is another piece, because the mind is very strong. And if people believe that everyone can have pleasure but them, everyone else's body is more orgasmic than theirs, then nothing can change.
Right. I really liked what you said about the polarity and how we're really struggling to figure out how to dance and have the balance of these things to understand the big picture. And it reminds me of the things that we're going through as a collective global community right now around racism, and how I've been having a lot of conversations about this. And when we don't acknowledge the racist background that a lot of our ancestry comes from, it's like we're taking energy away from what's possible to bring something new forward, to learn how to confront that fear, whatever that fear is for why racism even exists in the first place. How, if we turn away from that, we can't fully embrace this lifetime in a meaningful way, because it's sucking energy from us to not be able to look at that shadow.
For sure. For sure. One of the things I often find myself saying to groups is helping them become aware, all of us, and I had to become aware of it, it didn't come naturally to me, that if we're holding down any emotions, whether that's fear or guilt or shame or desire, it takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of energy to hold those things in, particularly the stronger they are. And the more you hold those down with all your energy, the less energy you have for anything else. It really drains the life force. It really drains the physical body. It really drains the capacity for, exploration, creativity, everything. Everything gets drained in trying to suppress anger, trying to suppress sadness. And it's very clear to me that most human beings living in the modern world that come to either groups or as individual clients that I do, and I'm sure you probably see the same, that most people are like a pressure cooker full of emotions just waiting to explode. Like one of the big pieces of the work we do in ISTA is around the emotional body and how important it is to learn to express and release and in a healthy way. Because most people are, it's why we have road rage, it's why we have, trolley rage in the supermarket. We're holding everything down. At some point, something small happens and the gasket comes off and the reaction is disproportionate. We can't control it. It becomes like uncontrollable, unconscious rage. So one of the biggest things I think the human race we could do best from learning is understanding our emotional body, learning how to trust it, learning how to move it. And interestingly, when I used to work in surgery, I often saw people very much at the end of life or very sick. And my sense is that, and in fact, I know from studies of physiology related to emotionality, that the body becomes buckled, it becomes shut down, the life force becomes shut down. So when we're here and right now and we have fear over COVID, we have, conspiracy theories, whether we think they're true or not, pulling our energy and attention. We now have these, huge uproars of, it's time to look at the race issues in our places. Also, I noticed a lot of countries that are moving changes on the lesbian, gay, and transgender laws at the moment. So there's so much, and most people don't know how to let that move through them. They don't know how to express it through the body. So they become tight, they become stressed, they become sick, and rational, reasonable responses are not possible. Things happen like a knee-jerk reaction. So, but it's terrifying for most people to look there. And I remember myself, the first time I attempted to even look there at what might be living in my body at that age that had not been expressed. So it's understandable that people don't know how to do that on their own, and most people need some kind of support container to really be able to fully drop in, to be held in that, because it is a journey.
Yeah.
Um,
And it's there's such a need for integration of that journey, like not just talk therapy, not just body work, not just spiritual practices. Well, I'm sure we all can all interpret spiritual practices, but I think that in terms of honoring the body as a spiritual vessel, like to have a body, I find to be a very spiritual gift.
mm,
And I think that a lot of times people maybe dissociate from the body as if it's just this thing that's the house of their soul or spirit. But to know how to tense the muscles and then relax, and to learn these practices and let the body be a vessel for some of that clearing. And I know you know a lot of practices about how to start moving some of that energy. Do you want to share some
mm.
things that you've learned or about how people can start to check in with themselves and start moving maybe some things little by little?
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to speak to the thing where you was talking about spiritual practices, and one thing that's been very interesting. I've had a number of people come to the work that I do, which is all embodiment based, who have spent many years, some of them as Buddhist monks, some of them as people purely working in the spiritual realms, and on their own reflection, they have neglected the body. They've been looking to transcend the body, and I don't have judgment if someone wants to do that. But for me, it's like, I have this life with this body for this time. I want to be in this body while I'm here. I have plenty of time, I think, to be spirit floating around in source. So for me, the real beauty comes when we start to bring spirituality and the temple back into the body, the God back into the self. But as far as in working with emotions go, the first thing that people can do, which is super simple, is just learn how to breathe. You know, the biggest block to most people is that people are shallow upper chest breathing, not breathing into their belly, because if you do, you'll feel more. And so there's a shutdown, and many people are running on adrenaline, so there's upper chest breathing. So any type of breath practice that you can do, and breath can be really powerful. I work with shamanic breathwork, which is a very powerful, deep process that I wouldn't recommend you jumping into that as a starting point necessarily. But, you know, to learn how to use breath in a regulating way to be able to down and up regulate your system, to bring your nervous system down, but mainly to become present. And once you can breathe, then you will start to feel things. And they might feel like physical sensations, or they might feel like they might be clearly emotions, or they might be just energy. And there's many ways you can, simple techniques you can do with the body to essentially shake out that old emotion, which comes out as energy. And Peter Levine's work around the understanding of how as human animals we've forgotten how to release trauma at the time it occurs. So we have a backlog. Whenever you start this work, you have a backlog of however many years and however many things you haven't expressed. So you can start slowly. Shaking is a great way, Kundalini shaking. For some people, dynamic type meditation, some of the Osho meditations can be a great way to do that in a held space if you feel you need it. TRE is a form of trauma release exercise, which can be beautiful and can be gentler than some of the more dynamic expressions. In ISTA, we teach a group of emotional release tools, which are partly bioenergetic. Some of them are related to old shamanic practices, where, you know, one of them is essentially you pound pillows in a safe way without hurting yourself and with consciousness present. Because if you just let the body scream and shout and rage and you're not present, nothing is actually released. You're just taking this emotion and like re-traumatizing might be a bit harsher word, but essentially ricocheting the energy around in you. You have to be present. You have to not hurt yourself. You have to learn ways to move the energy. Laurie Handlers has an amazing video online where she shows this bioenergetic emotional release thing. Really simple, really easy. There's more and more free things online. If you have, or you know you have some really big traumatic events in your body, then it can be good to perhaps seek someone out to hold space for you for that. And some people don't know that they have those things in their body until they start doing it. So again, if you start doing it and you start to feel like, wow, this is really overwhelming, then slow down, make things gentler, and and seek some, you know, some support if you need it.
Yeah, in terms of supporting people with knowing where to look or what to search for when wanting support or space to be held for them for this type of release work, what would you suggest looking up, or where would you start someone if they're really wanting to start looking at this stuff?
I mean, I say this not because I'm a facilitator for them, but the ISA training is one of the most powerful places I feel in the planet right now to find that, to the depth that you can go to with the amount of supervision, with the amount of holding, and also with a group of people willing to go into that, which can really deepen the experience that we have. So definitely, if you have things, and most humans do, with your emotional body, until you start working with them, it's the training, level 1 training is an amazing place for that. There's there's websites that have registers for TRE practitioners all over the world, actually. But I always recommend to ask for someone that personally that someone recommends, because training and certification doesn't always mean that someone actually in reality is that good a practitioner. You know, there's a more chance they will be than perhaps someone who's not trained. But equally, someone who's not trained but who has a lot of experience can sometimes be a more effective practitioner working with trauma. So it can be tricky. Go on personal recommendations. The other group of people are sexological body workers who will work with somatic presence, and also they work with a very client-led focus. So it's actually the client who is managing their own system, teaching people how to support. I've also worked in myself and with other sort of people who work with Tantra and Tantric body work, which is another way if someone is experienced as long as they understand the emotional body. If they start to work with tantric body work, they don't understand the emotional body, they may not be able to hold you in that. Another one of my kind of prongs has been body de-armoring. Body de-armoring is another great place, and there are some good courses online. Again, go on recommendations. I know that Sanita has a de-armoring course, which many people I know have been on, which is good, which helps you to, de-armor the body in specific places. Somatic experiencing is another one that people are trained, and there's all kinds of trauma specialists, but actually a body worker with a good understanding of the emotional body is also a very good place to seek support. Be very, very cautious around who you work with when you're working with this, because sadly there are some people offering this work in the field that actually are not able to hold that, particularly in sexuality. So go on recommendations, ask on forums for people that you trust, for people, and never blindly just look somebody up on the internet and go, yeah, say that. But quite a high proportion of my clients actually, well, a reasonable portion of my clients used to do that, and I used to be amazed that they were just like, oh, I just googled this and you showed up and I just came here. So again, sometimes there is those kind of places where there's an intuition that comes in. And there's books, there's some really good books around on understanding emotions, but my sense is that we can over intellectualize things, and that actually for some people it's really important that their mind understands a little bit about how it works in order to be able to trust the emotional body. But there's a danger that actually it becomes distracting, and actually the real practice is actually moving it through the body. So knowledge can be important, but actually it's the practice itself that actually makes the difference to the body.
Yes, thank you. Wow, time is just flying. Is there anything else that you would like to add to wrap up our session together today?
Hmm. Maybe just to speak to, and it probably will be on your forum, but just to speak to the importance of pleasure as a medicine, as a prayer, as something that nurtures us physically, that changes our physiology, that changes our biochemistry, that changes our thoughts, and also that is a way of connecting with the divine. And this link between sexuality and spirituality, which in society has been actually put at odds and separated from one another. Part of the beauty of Tantra and part of the beauty of sacred sexuality work is as learning to bring back this connection between sex and spirit. For me, they're the same thing. For me, it's a life force. For me, it's an open channel. And society has taught us we can be spiritual but not sexual, or sexual not spiritual. And for me, the biggest healing we can do for ourselves is to actually bring these together. Bringing alchemizing in the heart, bringing together these two polarities, and understanding that making love to yourself or with someone else, or being in nature, is a form of prayer. The more and more we become used to the idea that the body is our experience of devotion, and that nature and other people and the way that we connect is our experience of devotion. So, and pleasure is a big piece of that. And both sexuality and spirituality have been affected by this shame, punishment. You've got to get things right, worthiness, obsessiveness on either side. People are all for them or all against them, and realizing that pleasure is not just about sexual pleasure. That's what many people think it's about. It is the capacity to rest. It's the capacity to play, to feel pleasure in your emotions, to have pleasurable thoughts, sensuality. And understanding that if you do not clear what's in the way of these lower level womb pleasure games and play, then you often cannot access essential sexual and you cannot access spiritual pleasure and bliss. So that's the model that I work with the mastery of pleasure, is we cannot get to spiritual bliss and spiritual pleasure if we have blockages in this progressive development of our capacity for pleasure.
Mm, beautiful. Thank
Mm-hmm.
you so much for how much you added to this summit through your wisdom and the work you've been doing with mastering your pleasure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.